Hi everyone. Welcome to our Young Wavemaker seminar. This is our second one this year, and we are so excited to have you, and especially so excited to welcome Rachel for today. So thank you so much for joining us. To start off, my name is Ava. I'm one of the program coordinators for K Perpetua Collaborative, and this is our speaker series. So we get to invite some super cool young people to come talk for us about their nerd interests. Where that starts, I just like to introduce you to what K Perpetua Collaborative is and just tell you a little bit about the area. We work in the K Perpetua area. Generally speaking, Yachats to Florence encompasses Oregon's largest marine reserve. So we work in the beautiful Sislaw Forest. All of our programs are kind of designed to show the interconnectedness of land to sea. So we've got a lot of stuff going on in the forest and a lot of stuff going on in the ocean and kind of bring them together. A little bit about us. In 2017, we all came together to form the K Perpetua Collaborative. Our mission is to foster conservation and collaboration within local communities for scientific exchange, management, awareness, and stewardship from the land to the sea in and around K Perpetua Marine Reserve. We've got all of our partners up on screen. I'd highly encourage you to you probably do recognize a lot of them, but if you haven't checked them out already, highly recommend. The biggest part of us is just a big community coming together to be able to protect such a cool area and get the community involved. So we offer some amazing programs, and we highly encourage you to come participate if you would like. We have a lot of citizen science opportunities like our sea star monitoring, our marine debris surveys and bioblitzes, such as our fungi bioblitzes and seabird colony monitoring. And we also offer in the field learning opportunities like our tide pool tours in the summer with Jamie, who's in this mushroom hat right here. Next week is our Land Sea Symposium on November 18th. That is going to be a big event, and if you haven't signed up already or would like to join us online, definitely check out our website because that's going to be super fun. But we couldn't really do any of this without our amazing volunteers, so we very much love for people to get involved and join us, and if you would like, please definitely reach out. We are always welcome to new volunteers, and there's always ways for you to be involved, even if you're not interested in stuff that we currently have going on. And shameless plug, we have really cool shirts. So there are many ways to support us. If you can't get involved, buy a shirt. We accept donations on the website, but if you're going to donate, definitely get a shirt too, because then you can just have this really cool shirt. Repping the brand. I love it. Just please connect with us on our socials and hang with us in our adventures. All of our website stuff gets updated to show our new events and stuff that is happening. And we're very active on there. So if you reach out over email, Facebook or Instagram, you'll definitely get a reply. We're super happy to chat. And then before we start, there are two upcoming events here. So in person at our K Perpetua Visitor Center, we're going to be hearing from an artist named Janet Esley on the 11th. And then we'll have another Young Wavemakers coming up with Fox on the 4th of December. So super excited. There will be more than these two, so just definitely keep checking our website, Facebook, Instagram, all of that stuff. We'll definitely let you know when it's happening. But I will stop talking now and let you meet Rachel. I will leave this up for a second. She's going to introduce herself, so I will not bore you guys with reading this entire thing. But we're so excited to have you. I'm going to stop screen sharing and let you get on with it.
All right, well, thank you so much for the introduction. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining this evening. As Ava mentioned, my name is Rachel Hilt. I'm a Master of Environmental Management graduate from Duke University. I worked under the supervision of Dr. Andy Reed and Brianna Elliott on my master's project titled The Evolution of Marine Mammal Stock Definitions and Management Implications under the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act. Just to provide a little overview of what I'm going to be talking about, I'll start with an introduction to give some background into the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and then I'll go into my guiding research questions for my project. I'll go into some of the methods that I used that included a literature review and conducting some interviews with agency scientists. Then I'll go into my results, which includes a detailed assessment of the evolution of how marine mammal stocks have been defined. I also have a couple of case studies for some evidence, and I'll also provide those stakeholder perspectives on stock assessments from the interviews that I did. And then I'll go ahead and wrap things up with some recommendations that I have to improve the stock assessment process in the United States and abroad. So just to get into some of the background, so up until the mid 20th century, many species of marine mammals were on a pretty serious decline. So in the last century alone, there have been studies that show that about 3 million cetaceans were killed by industrial harvesting, which does represent one of the largest removals of any animal in history relative to its biomass. So just to provide a couple of examples of that, the photo that you see in the top right corner is a critically endangered North Atlantic right whale. And this species, much like many other large whales, was pretty much depleted after centuries of commercial whaling in the United States. And fun fact, the North Atlantic right whale actually gets its name from commercial whalers who nicknamed it as the right whale to harvest, since their carcasses would float in the water instead of sink like some of their larger counterparts. But those animals, after facing a lot of fishing pressure, were pretty much depleted. And just to provide another example, those animals that you see at the bottom, you probably recognize as dolphins. So in the 1960s and 1970s, the yellowfin tuna fishery in the Eastern tropical Pacific was estimated to have killed about hundreds of thousands of dolphins per year as bycatch. So bycatch is just the accidental killing of marine mammals or any other animals that are not the target species of a commercial fishery. And so the scientific community and the public knew that these animals were declining pretty rapidly and past a point where they might not recover from it. So after a lot of public outcry and pressure from the scientific community, the Marine Mammal Protection Act was passed in 1972. And it did have two primary goals. So that was first to prevent marine mammals from diminishing past a point where they would no longer be functioning elements of their ecosystems. And I did underline the word ecosystem since this was the first federal statute that used the word ecosystem. So Congress was finally able to recognize the function that these animals had to the marine environment as a whole instead of just on a species level. And the second goal of the MMPA was to restore diminished species to their optimum sustainable population. So an optimum sustainable population just means that there's enough members of a population to remain functioning elements of their ecosystem. So there are many reasons as to why the MMPA was a very successful piece of legislation. And the one that I cover that's most relevant to my research is the dividing up of marine mammals into stocks. So the MMPA defines stocks as a group of animals of the same species or similar taxa within a common spatial arrangement that interbreed when mature. So the stock itself is the conservation unit that is used pretty much just to quantify how many animals are out there, so appropriate conservation measures can be put in place. So a couple of other important highlights from the Marine Mammal Protection Act. For all marine mammals under U.S. jurisdiction, the MMPA established a moratorium of take of marine mammals. So take is defined as to harass, hunt, capture, or kill, or any attempt to harass, hunt, capture, or kill any marine mammal. It also banned marine mammal products and marine mammals themselves from being imported into the United States. And it also mandated that a biological reference point, or PBR, be established for each stock. So PBR stands for potential biological removal, and that just means the number of animals that could be removed from the environment by humans, excluding the natural mortality that already does occur. But how many animals can be removed from the environment while still having them maintain their optimum sustainable population numbers. So in the United States, there are two federal agencies that are in charge of implementing the MMPA. So the first is the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NMFS for short, as I'll call them. And the second is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So NMFS is in charge of managing cetaceans, sea lions, and seals. And the Fish and Wildlife Service manages a smaller number of stocks that includes sea otters, manatees, walruses, and polar bears. And the MMPA also mandated the creation of a third agency called the Marine Mammal Commission. And they are a government organization that provides oversight to science, policy, and management that protects marine mammals. And that kind of work entails reviewing existing policies and then making recommendations to NIMFs or the Fish and Wildlife Service to help improve the implementation of the MMPA. So there were several amendments that were made to the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1994. So to start, there was a statutory definition of the term harassment. So that is defined as any act of pursuit, torment, or annoyance with the potential to either injure or disrupt a marine mammal's behavioral pattern. So injure is a level A harassment, and anything that disrupts their behavior is considered a level B harassment. And there are different punishments that someone might incur based off of the level of harassment that they inflict on a marine mammal. There were also exceptions to the moratorium on take established. So this allowed small numbers of marine mammals to be taken from the marine environment, which includes Alaska native subsistence harvesting, the implementation of offshore renewable energy, offshore oil drilling, or any scientific research activities. And so the third amendment that was made that's most relevant to my research is the requirement for stock assessment reports to be created for all marine mammals under US jurisdiction. So these stock assessment reports contain a variety of information. So to start, there is a description of that stock's geographic range, so where those animals live, where they're migrating to. There's also a minimum population estimate. So that's just an estimate of how many animals are in the stock with a reasonable assurance that the estimate is either greater than or equal to, or reasonable assurance that the stock size is greater than or equal to that estimate. There are also current population trends, current max net productivity rates, so how many animals are being born, how many are being put back into the environment. There are also potential biological removal levels, so that PBR that I mentioned earlier, that's just an estimate of the max number of animals that can be removed from human activity while still allowing those animals to maintain their optimum sustainable population. And then another important aspect is the status of the stock as to whether or not it is strategic or not strategic. So a strategic stock is one where the level of direct human-caused mortality exceeds that potential biological removal level. So humans are removing more animals from the environment than what their populations can sustain to remain healthy. And a non-strategic stock is just a stock of animals that does not exceed, where the human caused mortality does not exceed that potential biological removal. And it'll also include whether or not that stock or that species is ESA listed. So under the Endangered Species Act as to whether or not it is endangered or threatened. So stock assessments reports will also include estimates of annual human-caused mortality and what is causing that mortality or injury based on the source, as well as any descriptions of the factors that are causing that decline or impeding their recovery. So all marine mammal stocks are reviewed every 3 years by the respective agencies that manage each species. So they're reviewed every 3 years, or at least until new information becomes available if they're not strategic. So if they're not under a lot of anthropogenic pressure, those stock assessment reports will be reviewed every 3 years. But if they are labeled strategic and they are facing a lot of pressure, they will be reviewed annually. And so when that marine mammal stock is being reviewed, the stock assessment report is drafted by the National Marine Fisheries Service or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Those drafts then become available for public comment and review. And then once that public comment period is over, it'll then be reviewed by the respective agencies. And then it'll also be reviewed by the respective scientific review groups for which that species resides. So once they get input from one of these scientific review groups, and they go back to the agencies again. At that point, they'll be submitted for final publication. So the MMPA only provides a very general guidance on the methods that are required to create the marine mammal stock assessment reports. So NIMS and the Fish and Wildlife Service convened to create a more uniform framework for developing stock assessment reports. And they published a report called the Guidelines for Assessing Marine Mammal Stocks, or GAMS for short. And since 1994, when the amendment to create stock assessment reports was first mandated, 6 of those workshops have been held to develop proper guidelines and make sure that that definition of stocks is being applied consistently. So another rule that I would like to touch on that's relevant to my research is the MMPA import provisions rule. So in 2016, this was passed to ban fish or fish products from being imported into the United States from other countries that have levels of bycatch that exceed the standards that have been set by the United States. And so in order to continue importing seafood into the US, those countries are required to submit a comparability finding. So that just means they have to provide evidence to the US government that they do have regulatory programs to mitigate their levels of bycatch and keep them in line with the standards set by the United States. So initially, there was a 5-year grace period for countries to develop their regulatory programs, and that 5-year grace period has actually been extended. And the last I checked, countries are now being given until December 31st to submit their comparability findings, just to give NIMS additional time to review and evaluate those applications, make sure that they're communicating with exporting nations, and make their final determinations. So to get into the research questions that I asked for my project, I wanted to know how the formal definition of marine mammal stocks has changed over time. I wanted to know what the viewpoints among scientists regarding how stocks should be defined under the MMPA was. And I was also interested in figuring out how other countries could create or improve their marine mammal stock assessment process to meet the standards being set by the United States. So I asked those questions for a couple of reasons. So first, to go about conserving marine mammals, you do need an appropriate conservation unit, which is the stock. And for conservation to be successful, you need consistent parameters for what defines a stock. And we have a robust process for doing that here in the United States. But of course, it's not perfect. And now that we are mandating other countries to do the same, it's important now more than ever that our framework for doing so is the best that it can possibly be, especially if other countries will be looking to the United States for guidance. And even if they may not have sufficient resources to implement the same kinds of programs that we have here. So just to get into the literature review that I did, as I mentioned, since the MMPA only provides a very general guidance on what to include in marine mammal stock assessments, I looked to the GAMS reports to figure out the specific changes that have been made to what defines a marine mammal stock. And I also have 2 case studies that I felt did a really great job of exemplifying complex stock structure. So I have the Alaska harbor seal and the Florida manatee that I'll touch on in a little bit as well. And I addressed my second and third research question by conducting 10 semi-structured interviews with 4 different interest groups. So I intended to talk to employees from the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, since they're the ones that draft the stock assessment reports. I also wanted to talk to members from the scientific review groups, since they're the ones that advise the National Marine Fisheries Service and Fish and Wildlife Service on creating the stock assessment reports and providing edits to them. I also reached out to NGOs for their perspective on bringing legal action to these issues, as well as some employees from external research organizations and universities, since they're the ones that supply a lot of the data that the stock assessment reports are based on. So getting into the review that I did from the GAMS report. So the first report in 1995 defined stocks based on their ecology, life history, morphology, genetics, and the area of mortality. So for the area of mortality, if there was no biological stock data available, then the stocks were going to be defined based off of the area where they were taken from. And so this was initially problematic because it didn't account for marine mammals that migrate quite a bit and might experience mortality in different areas based on the different seasons. So in 1996, consistent with the parameters from the 95 workshop, they also added distribution, population response data, but they also decided to only designate a stock if there was clear evidence that the two populations were isolated from each other. So no longer were they going to be defined based off of the area of mortality that they were experiencing. So in 2005, there were a couple of more additions: contaminants, isotopes, parasites, and oceanographic habitat differences. And in 2011, they added acoustic call types, as well as if there were demographically independent populations or DIPs. So a demographically independent population just means that that specific stock is being affected by births and deaths and not emigration or immigration between two populations. And they can also, the management for those can get a little bit complicated as well. So multiple demographically independent populations could exist within one stock, or those dips could be managed as separate stocks. So in 2016, there were no more changes to the definition. The most recent workshop in 2023 mandated that demographically independent population delineation was now going to occur as a separate process from stock delineation. So what I really wanted to highlight from this graphic was just how complex this process is and how granular that definition of what constitutes a marine mammal stock has become over time, over the last 25 years since the stock assessment reports have been mandated. So the first case study that I will touch on is the Alaska harbor seal. And I included this because, as I mentioned, I think it's a really good example of just how complex an animal stock structure can become and how difficult it can be to delineate stocks. And these animals are also an integral part of Alaska Native people's diet, as well as their cultural identity. And they're also a really important part of the marine ecosystem as both predator and prey animals. And so also just to point out, these animals are managed under the National Marine Fisheries Service. So with the first stock assessment report that was published for the Alaska harbor seals in 1998, the National Marine Fisheries Service originally designated 3 stocks of Alaska harbor seals. So there was the Bering Sea stock, the Gulf of Alaska stock, and the Southeast Alaska stock. You can see that they are separated by those dotted lines. And their delineation was made off of phylogenetic data. So that included distributional data, population response, phenotypic, and genotypic data. So there was quite a bit of criterion that was used to divide up those stocks. But there was a study that was published in 2003 that provided evidence that the designation of those 3 stocks was too broad to be able to meet the standards set by the MMPA. So that study included analyzing mitochondrial DNA from over 800 harbor seals across 180 sites throughout Alaska. So it was a very thorough study that was done. And the results from that found a pattern of genetic differentiation that correlated to 12 different sites. So 12 demographically independent populations of harbor seals. But just because the National Marine Fisheries Service had this information, it didn't mean they could necessarily just divide up the stocks right away and publish that on the next stock assessment report. There was a pretty big regulatory process that they had to follow to be able to do that, which is what I'll get into next. So to start, there were a lot of different players involved. And to start, the American Institute of Biological Sciences organized a review of that study back in 2004 So there was a lot of back and forth as to whether or not mitochondrial DNA was an effective tool for delineating demographic independence. A lot of scientists felt that it did not provide enough information about the interbreeding potential between the different populations. But at the end of their review, they did come to a consensus that the three stocks were too broad, and that they did need to be divided up further. So in 2006, NIMS published stock assessment reports for those three stocks. They didn't quite delineate them just yet, but they did acknowledge that they were still reviewing that study that was published, but they could not reflect those changes yet until they had come to an agreement with their co-management partners, the Alaska Native Harbor Seal Commission. So stock delineation does affect Alaska Native subsistence harvest. So the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Harbor Seal Commission signed an agreement in 1999 to work together in order to co-manage the harbor seal stock. So both sides were getting their voices heard. So the Alaska Scientific Review Group was also involved in this process. In 2007 and 2009, when the next iteration of stock assessment reports were published, they still did not reflect the changes that the study recommended be included, so delineating those stocks into 12. So the Alaska Scientific Review Group wrote a letter to NIMS at one of their annual review meetings that encouraged them to move forward with redesigning the stocks. And in 2011, the Marine Mammal Commission also weighed in with their opinion and recommended that NIMS formally recognize the 12 stocks of Alaska harbor seals after they had felt like there had been enough agreement between NIMS and the Harbor Seal Commission. So in 2011, the stock assessment report officially recognized 12 demographically independent harbor seal stocks. And all of the information from the stocks was included in one stock assessment report. And you can see each of them highlighted in red. There are quite a few now. And so, like I mentioned, I think this is a really interesting case study because it demonstrates how complex this whole process is and how long it can take, and just how many stakeholders are involved as well. And there is also the added layer of complexity with the Alaska harbor seals being part of Alaska Native subsistence harvest and their cultural identity. So it's really important that those decisions are being made in a way that's inclusive of everybody involved. So for my second case study, I looked at the stock structure of the Florida manatee, which is managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So these animals have been a focus of a lot of research and conservation efforts since they were first listed under the Endangered Species Act as endangered in the 70s when the act was first passed. And this story is a lot shorter than the one of the Alaska harbor seals, but I also still think it's a really great example. So to begin, in 2001, the Fish and Wildlife Service published what's called a Florida Manatee Recovery Plan. So these recovery plans are mandated by the Endangered Species Act as part of a conservation effort in order to increase population numbers. So that plan loosely recognized four subpopulations based on the Florida manatee's migration to the same warm water refuges during the winter months. So Florida manatees have a really hard time thermoregulating their bodies, kind of like we do if we're in cold water for too long. They'll go into hypothermia if they get too cold. So during the winter, when the water temperature drops, they migrate to warmer areas, and that looks like this. So this is an example of a winter aggregation. They also do happen to gather around power plants. So a lot of power plants will dispel warm water, and that attracts the manatees, but also does provide a whole other host of issues, which I won't be touching on. But that is what one of those winter aggregation looks like. So the subpopulations are the Northwest, Southwest, Atlantic coast, and St. John's River populations. And since the 1970s and up until relatively recently, the Florida manatee populations were on a pretty steady increase. So in 2007, instead of the Florida Manatee Recovery Plan, there was a Florida manatee management plan that was published, and that classified those 4 subpopulations as management units. So they weren't recognized as different stocks, they were just being labeled as management units. So in 2009, there was another study that looked at microsatellite primers within those 4 subpopulations of manatees. And it did determine that there was enough gene flow occurring between them that there wasn't a whole lot of genetic differentiation between those 4 subpopulations. So that study was reflected in the first stock assessment report that was published in 2014, which used those low levels of genetic differentiation amongst the 4 management units to justify their management as one singular stock. So to date, that stock assessment report that was published in 2014 is the only stock assessment report that exists for the Florida manatee. And so that is how they are managed to this day, just as one stock with the recognition that there's 4 different management units. So just to kind of sum up both of those case studies, I think it's really interesting to highlight the variability in how marine mammal species are managed, especially between different agencies. So moving into the interviews that I conducted, I did 10 semi-structured interviews with my 4 different interest groups. So there were 2 employees from external research organizations, 2 scientific review group members. There was 1 scientist from a nonprofit organization and 5 employees from the National Marine Fisheries Service. So I do recognize that my study is limited by the fact that I did not have any representation from the Fish and Wildlife Service. I had reached out to several employees, but none of them had agreed to participate in the interview. And kind of given the limitations of the amount of time that I had for my project, I was not able to speak with any of them. So I asked 10 questions to my interviewees, but the most relevant ones that I'll share here included: what kind of evidence do you think is necessary to define a stock under the MMPA? Do you believe that stocks are defined consistently under the MMPA across agencies and applications of the statute? And do you think the current stock definition and stock assessment process under the MMPA is sufficient to meet management goals under the MMPA? So there were some pretty obvious points of agreement and disagreement amongst the scientists. So to start, all of the scientists agreed that genetic data was the most valuable data available to unveil stock boundaries. None of the scientists agreed that stocks were defined consistently across agencies, so both between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. But I also did hear from several scientists that even within the different regional offices of the National Marine Fisheries Service, a lot of the scientists felt that there were still differences in the organization with how stocks were defined. And so then I also figured out that half of the scientists felt that stocks were being assessed properly, but the data and the stock assessment reports were suffering from a lack of funding allocated by Congress to conduct stock assessment research as often as the MMPA mandates. So I wanted to touch on another question that I had asked my interviewees. So I asked them, how can other countries create or improve their marine mammal stock assessment process to meet the standards set by the United States? So I asked this question in particular, since it does carry a lot of weight in my project, and I just pulled out some relevant quotes that help me inform the recommendations that I will touch on shortly. But overall, the participants quoted here noted that to meet the standards of the import provisions rule, other countries are going to need data similar to what we have in the United States, and that they should look to the large wealth of information that we have available. So, for example, the top quote, one scientist indicated that we would need abundance estimates and mortality estimates. That quote on the bottom suggested that other countries look to the GAMS reports and the stock assessment reports, for example. And That quote on the left, one of the scientists also mentioned that other countries can understand different stocks based on analogy. So, for example, if one stock of marine mammals is facing high levels of mortality from a specific type of fishing gear in one region, if another region is using that same type of fishing gear, you can probably assume that there are similar levels of bycatch happening. And then I think it's also really important to mention the quote on the right from the scientist that mentioned the equity issues that are going to present themselves, since not all countries are going to have the same amount of resources to manage marine mammal stocks the same way that we do in the United States. So to get into my recommendations, for other countries that are now being asked to follow the import provisions rule, I recommended that the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Marine Mammal Commission develop an executive summary that provides guidance to other countries on how to incorporate the stock definition into the stock assessment process. So there's a lot of information available that tells other countries what they need to do, but there's not a whole lot of guidance on how other countries can actually go about doing it. So there is a very big information gap there. And while the GAMS reports and the stock assessment reports are very useful and provide a wealth of information, they are incredibly dense and they're very long. So that could provide overwhelming, or that could prove to be overwhelming for a country that's in search of a starting point or an entry point. And based off of what I found in my research, I think some of the guidance that the guidance that should exist, other countries should look into existing data on bycatch problems through analogy. So as I mentioned earlier, if bycatch is occurring in one area with a specific gear type, we can probably make an assumption that bycatch is also going to be happening in other areas that are using the same type of gear. Other countries could also emulate the data collection techniques that we have here in the United States if they do have the sufficient resources to be able to do so. Or they could also explore tools to use in data poor situations. So over the last couple of years, there have been several studies published that provide a lot of tools for countries to use if they don't have a lot of access to data about their own marine mammal populations. So my recommendations for domestic improvements, to improve assessments in our own country, I recommended that NIMS and the Fish and Wildlife Service develop a more of a clear prioritization for stock assessment research within and between agencies. So as I mentioned earlier, my study was limited by a lack of representation from the Fish and Wildlife Service, but of the scientists that I interviewed, none were able to report that stocks were defined consistently between agencies. And I did also have several of them report that stocks were inconsistently defined even between the fishery centers, regional science centers, such that some science centers were prioritizing stock assessment research and some were not. So I thought it would be useful for the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service to publish an additional report that mandates stock assessment research to be put at the forefront of all science centers' research initiatives. And in addition to that, I also recommend that they petition Congress to allocate the funding that's necessary to implement stock assessments as often as they are mandated by the MMPA. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of participants felt that the stock assessment process was robust, but they're not conducted as often as the MMPA mandates that they should be. So I think that increasing the amount of funding available is going to help close a lot of those data gaps. So just to kind of touch on the big picture of my project and the implications that this has for management as a whole. In order to assess the health of marine mammals, we need a conservation unit for doing so, which is the stock. And other countries are going to have to define their conservation units properly in order to begin their own regulatory programs. And the United States does have a framework for doing so that other countries can look to. But as I mentioned, even with all of the money that the United States has, according to the majority of the scientists that I spoke to, there's still not an adequate amount of funding being put into the stock assessment programs to even do it up to our own standards that we've set. So with that being said, though, over the last 25 years that this program's been implemented, there's been a huge investment of time and millions of dollars of money. And now that we are requiring other countries to do the same, this is going to pose a very significant management challenge in the future, especially if those countries don't have sufficient resources to be able to do so. So that's pretty much all the information that I have. I'd like to thank my academic advisor, Dr. Andy Reed and Brianna Elliott, for all of their help over the last 2 years in making my master's project possible, as well as my master's cohort that I graduated with. Couldn't have done it without their support as well. And thank you all so much for your time today and for listening to me talk about stocks. I also included my contact information if anyone wants to follow up, and I'll take any questions that you have.
Awesome, perfect. Thank you so much, Rachel. This has been absolutely amazing. I'm so happy that we could have you as our second Young Wavemaker this year. And thank you for putting up your contact information. Is it all right that I share that on our YouTube as well, or do you want me to cut out this last slide?
Yes.
Perfect.
Oh,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah, you can go ahead. Yeah,
Sweet. It looks like there's one person who actually asked a question in the Q&A.
sure. Oh, yes. Okay, so question was, are there any countries that you see as posing real problems for adopting the recommendations? So far into my research, I haven't really seen if there are any countries specifically that are posing any specific challenges. I think that's just because even with that 5 year grace period, we still are so early into the process for those comparability findings. I'm not quite sure that the results and the information from that has been released yet to the public. So I think it's a little bit early to tell as to whether or not there would be significant issues with that. But that is a really good question, and I'm definitely interested to see how that plays out as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you to everyone else watching. And I will shoot you the YouTube link so you can post it on LinkedIn and share it with your network and all of those lovely things. Thank you so much again for coming, and we are so happy to have you. So thank you.
Sounds great. Yeah, thank you for your time. Have a good rest of your night. Appreciate it.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.